Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to peel back the layers of, well, everyday reality, really, and uncover some of the invisible forces shaping it. We tend to think of stories as just entertainment, maybe, or facts as just cold, hard data. But what if these stories, these narratives are actually fundamental? What if they're the architecture of our reality, influencing everything from our personal beliefs right up to global policy, often without us even noticing? Today, we're diving into exactly that. We're exploring the intricate world of narrative hierarchies. All right, this is a key concept from Jalen Simoonovich's really quite groundbreaking work, the Cognosystemic theory of human psychosocial relational construction, or TCCR, let's call it that for short.
Right. And our aim today isn't just to, wade through dense academic theory. It's really about getting a handle on the symbolic stratification of narratives. That means how stories are layered, ranked almost, within what Simoonovich calls the cognosystem. Think of the cognosystem as society's shared mental map, the space where all these narratives interact and compete for influence. We want to unpack how narratives gain power, how they lose it, how they wield it, and, crucially, how they drive social change. The TCCR framework really aims to give fields like social work a solid, evidence-based way to grasp how narratives shape the world we inhabit.
And for you listening, understanding this, well, it's pretty profound. It can sharpen your critical thinking, help you navigate the, frankly, overwhelming amount of information out there, and maybe even empower you to be a more conscious agent of change, seeing those subtle currents beneath the surface. So let's start there, this core idea, narrative hierarchy. What exactly does Simoonovich mean by that in the TCCR?
It's a really powerful concept because it pushes past seeing narratives as just neutral tales. Simoonovich defines it as the structural and functional stratification of narrative systems. Basically, stories aren't just floating around randomly. They're organized in a kind of pecking order. And that order is based on their ability to influence our shared reality, how they organize meaning for us, and how they guide our actions, both individually and collectively. The key insight, really, is that narratives are never neutral. They always have potential. Structuring potential, setting norms, legitimizing potential, gaining authority, transformative potential, driving change, or resistant potential, pushing back. And it's these potentials that determine where they sit in the hierarchy.
That sounds like a really deep, almost invisible power structure shaping what we accept as true or important. Could you maybe walk us through the different levels, from the ones with the least power to the most influential? Give us a feel for how they work in the real world.
Absolutely. The TCCR lays out a kind of tiered classification. It reflects how much influence each type of narrative has within that shared mental space, the cognosystem. Okay, so right at the bottom, you have subjugated narratives. These are the voices that are pushed to the margins. They often lack legitimacy. Sometimes they're barely even visible in the wider conversation. Think about stories from communities displaced by, say, big industrial projects or environmental damage. Their accounts of harm, of rights abuses, they might just get drowned out or ignored completely in favor of the louder narratives about economic progress or national development. Their lack of visibility reinforces their powerlessness, you see.
Right, so their stories exist, but they don't get heard in the places that matter.
Precisely. Then, moving up a bit, we encounter resigned narratives. These are interesting. They involve a sort of passive acceptance of the way things are, even if it's harmful. A clear example might be communities stuck in long-term structural poverty. If people in that situation come to believe, well, this is just inevitable, there's nothing we can do, that narrative itself reinforces inaction. It subtly legitimizes the inequalities, even if no one says it out loud. It's that this is just how it is story.
So not fighting back, just accepting the status quo internally. What's next? Narratives with a bit more agency, perhaps?
Exactly. That brings us to adaptive narratives. These don't necessarily challenge the whole system, but they try to improve things for individuals or groups within the existing structures. Think about someone facing societal barriers who focuses pragmatically on getting more education or skills to navigate the current economic system. They're adapting to the dominant narratives, like meritocracy, without fundamentally questioning them.
Okay, working within the system.
Right. Then you get resilient narratives. These are really compelling. They actively resist the dominant or hegemonic forces, often by holding on to identity and cultural practices. Indigenous communities preserving their languages, their traditions, their worldviews against the pressure of globalized culture. That's a powerful example. They carve out a space, demonstrating that assimilation isn't the only option. They maintain their distinctiveness.
That's a key shift from adapting to actively preserving and creating a counter space. What about narratives that start to directly challenge the dominant ones?
Good question. That's where challenging narratives come in. These openly question the dominant structures, the assumptions everyone takes for granted. An example, discourses that point out how unequal access to good schools or cultural capital completely undermines the simple meritocracy story. They're saying, hang on, success isn't just about individual effort. Look at these systemic barriers. They aim to shake things up.
They're actively trying to destabilize the accepted view.
Yes. And just above those, you find emerging dominant narratives. These are the ones on the rise. They're gaining serious traction, moving towards becoming the new common sense. Think about the energy transition narrative. It started small, maybe with environmental groups, but now it's shaping government policy, corporate strategy. It's really permeated decision-making. Or digital connectivity. Once maybe a luxury, now it's framed as essential, a non-negotiable value driving infrastructure and access policies. These are narratives shifting from the edges towards the center.
Okay, and then at the very top, the most powerful.
That's where you find the hegemonic narratives. These are the big ones. The foundational stories that structure our social reality. They operate through broad consensus, often backed by institutions, law, media, education. They're often so deeply embedded, we don't even see them as narratives. They just feel like the way things are. Meritocracy is a classic example in capitalist society shaping how we see success, failure, opportunity, or national security. A hugely powerful narrative used to justify all sorts of actions, sometimes even limiting civil rights, all under the banner of safety and order. They're rarely debated. They're just accepted.
Right. So it's definitely not a static picture. These categories aren't fixed boxes. Narratives clearly move. They climb up, they fall down this ladder. So what are the forces driving that movement? What makes a narrative shift its position in the hierarchy?
That's where the TCCR gets really dynamic. Siminovich talks about a cycle. Narratives can consolidate. That's like a beta phase. They become stable, reinforce their position. They can enter a crisis, the alpha phase. This is when tensions build up, their core assumptions start getting questioned, maybe cracks appear, or, and this is where the movement really happens, that they can be transformed or displaced. That's the delta phase. This involves a real shakeup, new meanings get integrated, and their position in the hierarchy can change significantly, moving up or down.
Okay, a cycle of consolidation, crisis, and transformation.
Exactly. And this whole process is shaped by 4 key dimensions of narrative power that are constantly working within the Cognosystem. First, the structuring dimension. A narrative's power to set the rules, the norms, the values that guide behavior. Meritocracy structuring how we think about effort and reward, for example. Second, the legitimizing dimension. This is its ability to establish itself as a truth, often reinforced by institutions, schools, courts, media. Think how national security can make state actions seem unquestionable.
So one sets the rules, the other makes them seem inevitable or right. What about actually changing things?
Right. Third is the transformative dimension, a narrative's power to reframe reality, to actually promote significant change. Think of narratives that spark critical awareness, that mobilize people for action. And fourth, the resistant dimension, its capacity to push back against dominant narratives, to offer alternatives, to just say no. These 4 dimensions are always interacting, pushing and pulling, driving those shifts in the hierarchy.
This leads us right to the mechanisms of that displacement. How does a narrative actually move? How does it shift from, say, challenging to emerging dominant?
Siminovich outlines 3 main ways this happens. First, ascending displacement. This is when a lower-ranked narrative gains prominence, climbs the ladder. The sustainability movement is a great example. It started relatively small, maybe as a challenging narrative, right? But through advocacy, evidence, influential people adopting it, it moved into the mainstream, becoming emerging dominant, even influencing hegemonic corporate practices.
So it climbed up. What about the other direction?
That's descending displacement. When a dominant narrative loses its grip, its legitimacy fades. Think about the idea of lifetime stable employment. For generations, that was the goal, a hegemonic ideal. But it's largely been replaced by narratives about labor flexibility, entrepreneurship, the gig economy. The old story just doesn't hold the same power or reflect reality for many anymore.
Makes sense. And is there movement sideways, too? Not just up or down?
Yes, that's horizontal displacement. This happens when narratives at roughly the same level compete, influence each other, maybe even blend together. A good example is how conventional medicine and alternative medicine used to be seen as completely separate, often antagonistic. Now you see much more talk of integrative health combining approaches. It changes the options and the conversation within that broader health discourse, even if conventional medicine remains dominant overall. It's a shift on the same plane.
Interesting. So what actually triggers these movements ascending, descending, horizontal?
Several key factors are usually involved. Systemic crises are a big one. An economic crash, a pandemic, a major environmental event. These can shake up existing narratives and create openings for new ones. Think about how crises impact ideas about solidarity or government intervention. Adoption by influential actors is also critical. When powerful figures, institutions, or movements get behind a narrative, it gains momentum. Think Martin Luther King Jr. and civil rights, or big tech companies driving narratives about digital transformation. Then there's constant narrative feedback across the different levels, ideas bubbling up, trickling down, spreading sideways. And finally, perhaps most fundamentally, emotional resonance and contextual relevance. Does the story connect with people's feelings, their values, their lived experiences? Does it offer compelling explanations or solutions for the current moment? If it does, it has a much better chance of moving up.
It paints a picture of constant motion, narratives jostling, competing, sometimes clashing quite intensely, I imagine. What happens when these different narratives collide head-on, when that friction occurs?
That friction you mentioned, it's absolutely key. Those clashes between established traditional narratives and new emerging ones, they are often the very engine of transformation within the Cognos system. It's not always negative. Conflict can actually forge new understandings, new ways forward.
Can you give some examples of those kinds of clashes?
Sure, we see them all around us. Think about the persistent tension between narratives of unlimited industrial growth versus the urgent need for an energy transition. They represent fundamentally different ways of seeing the future. Or the clash between ideas of a homogeneous national identity and the reality of cultural pluralism in many societies today. In politics, you constantly see the friction between state interventionism, the government should step in, and the free market narrative, let market forces decide. These clashes can lead to what Symonimich calls discursive crises, where the old ways of talking about things just break down. But they can also lead to symbolic reformulations, finding new ways to frame old ideas or even innovative narrative syntheses, entirely new stories emerging from the conflict.
Okay, so conflict can be creative. But you mentioned crises, too. What happens when these clashes get really intense? Especially, in our world where media blurs the lines between fact, fiction, and narrative all the time. What are the real-world impacts?
This touches on something incredibly important, the tangible power of narratives, even fictional ones. Symonimich highlights a really stark, quite disturbing example. It's the case of the actor Fabian Frankel, who plays Sir Criston Cole in House of the Dragon. He faced intense online harassment, abuse, insults, because fans were conflating him, the actual person, with the actions of his fictional character in the show. People were sending him messages like, "I hate you," asking how he could become the worst based entirely on the plot of a TV series. It got so bad he actually had to shut down his social media for a while because he feared being physically attacked.
Wow. That's quite extreme.
It really is. And it's not just about celebrity culture or online toxicity, though that's part of it. It's a powerful illustration of how media narratives, even fantasy ones, act as discursive tools. They generate real social reactions. They have real impacts on real lives. It shows these narratives aren't neutral entertainment. They carry immense power and can profoundly shape how people perceive and react to the world, blurring those lines between the story and reality.
That's a sobering example. It really underscores the weight these narratives carry.
Yeah.
So if they have this much power, how does understanding all this, the hierarchies, the dynamics, the friction, how do they translate into practical action, particularly for a field like social work, which you mentioned earlier?
This is where the TCCR really offers practical value, especially for professionals aiming for social justice. Analyzing narrative hierarchies gives social workers concrete tools, methodological tools for intervention. It means they can learn to actively identify the dominant narratives that create or perpetuate exclusion. The stories that mask structural problems by blaming individuals for things like poverty or unemployment.
Right, seeing the story behind the problem.
Exactly. And conversely, they can detect those emerging narratives that have emancipatory potential, the ones that highlight injustice and offer pathways towards positive change. Armed with that understanding, they can then design strategic interventions. They can work to legitimize alternative discourses, helping marginalized narratives gain a foothold in social structures, in policy debates, in community conversations. Ultimately, it's about empowering professionals to support processes of symbolic change, to use a critical, transformative lens on narrative power itself, working towards a fairer distribution of that power in society. It's about being an active participant in reshaping the narrative landscape.
So it really moves beyond just analyzing the problem. It's about seeing those invisible narrative threads that shape everything and then strategically, intentionally trying to weave new ones, more inclusive, more empowering stories. It sounds like a very engaged, very active approach.
It has to be, really.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've covered quite a bit. We've gone from defining this subtle but powerful idea of narrative hierarchies to understanding their dynamics, how they move, how they get displaced. And we've touched on the very real impact of narrative friction, those clashes of stories. It's complex, definitely, but also incredibly revealing.
And understanding this narrative mobility, this constant jostling within the Cognosystem, it really lays bare the symbolic battles that shape our social world. Simunovich makes a crucial point here. Intervening in these narrative disputes, which the TCCR provides tools for, isn't just some academic exercise. It is, and I'm quoting here, a profoundly ethical, political, and professional act within contemporary social work. It's about taking conscious responsibility for the narratives that shape our collective reality.
And we really encourage you listening to reflect on this. This way of thinking about narrative hierarchies offers a powerful new lens, not just for professional fields, but for looking at the media you consume, the public debates you hear or take part in, even the personal stories you tell yourself and the stories you hear from others. So here's a final thought to leave you with. Consider the narratives that currently shape your perception of, say, success or failure in your own life. Where did those stories come from? What invisible structures or interests might they be serving? And what might happen if you started to identify and maybe challenge a resigned narrative in your own sphere? Perhaps a story that says things can't change in your community or your workplace or even within yourself. What if you consciously made space for an emerging dominant narrative, one focused on collective action, maybe, or creative solutions to take root instead? How might that tiny shift ripple outwards, changing not just your experience, but potentially influencing those around you too?